Welcome back to another flight with the Hobby Collector. This one is a mixed bag for me. On the upside, I got a chance to take a colleague who's had a lifelong obsession with aviation on a long cross-country flight from Chicago to Florida. On the less upside, this may be one of the last few aviation videos I get to release before I list the Columbia for sale. We'll talk about both of these, the good and the less good, on this first leg heading south between Schaumburg Airport and Athens, Georgia. Now, it was a brisk and windy, but super clear Thursday morning in December for this flight. It was about 50 degrees with winds 240 at 18, gusting 28. With some luck, 06 Charlie, Schaumburg Airport, departs from 27, so the wind really wasn't that much of a factor. I hopped over from executive, picked up some stray Randy, and we set out on a somewhat uncertain journey. Maybe a little foreshadowing there. I've heard with some regularity that departing IFR from under the west side of O'Hare here was basically impossible, and the recommendation is always to start VFR and pick up the clearance in the air. But it was early enough in the day, and I figured, why not try my luck? So I rang up departure, had a great chat with that controller, told him that I was on the ground in Schaumburg and hoping to pick up my IFR before departing. And his response was pretty unique to me. Let's see if I can help. Columbia 400? Yeah, I can get you out. Call me when you're first in line. So maybe the performance of the plane helped my case, but as I said, it was an easy and uneventful departure, which is always a good experience to give a passenger who hasn't been in a small plane in maybe a little while. We continued our departure, having intermittent climb with frequent level-offs in order to avoid that which is the O'Hare area turbine clutter. But eventually we made it up to our cruise altitude of 15,000 for the first leg. And after admiring the local landscape features from a little bit of a new perspective, Randy set right into grilling me on the how, the why, and the systems of flying in the GA world. Honestly, though, this was kind of a welcome change. Most of the time, my passengers are along the lines of Alila, who enjoys being in the plane, but mostly to get places, and has a distinct lack of wanting to be the pilot or understand everything about the pilot. Or they're the type of passenger that has their eyes glued outside, totally enamored with that fresh perspective. Now, there's nothing wrong at all with either of these types of passengers. In fact, I enjoy any reason to fly and the company that it brings. But when you get an aviation junkie who is looking to satisfy that curiosity, it just resonates a little bit differently.
What's this here?
It's also nice when you have a curious passenger and you get to experience some non-typical events. We had two distinct ones on this leg alone, the first of which was ATC making a query that was also a first time for me.
Are you picking up an ELT at all over there?
I am not, but I can listen closer.
Roger, thanks. Let me know.
Yeah, the first reason I've ever had to monitor guard that wasn't just to listen to the current generation of cat meows. There was nothing really for me to hear, at first, but after another 2 minutes, I now know very much what this sounds like. And yeah, it's very distinct. But the rest of flying over Indiana was pretty boring. Further south, we'll at least get a little bit more of an interesting landscape. Now, as I fly with more and more people, I'm finding a series of similar questions from passengers. They're typically around things like flight planning or how much notice I need to give the system before I fly. Sometimes it's about the what-ifs and emergencies, and sometimes it's about how hard is flying. In Randy's case, he wanted to get more into the nuts and bolts.
So what does your pre-flight consist of?
So pre-flight consists of a visual inspection on all the exterior of the plane.
And here's where I launch into my dissertation about his question. But if you're a pilot and you're watching this, you already know what I'm explaining, and this really isn't flight training. If you're a non-pilot and watching this, there's a good chance I've already given you this speech. Or you know Randy and that's why you're watching this. But however you slice it, I'll save you from that audio. The point of sharing this portion, though, is to encourage you to engage with the flying community if you have a chance. We're in an era where small planes have been highlighted recently as super unsafe or somehow more dangerous than ever before. But the truth is, that's not being contextualized properly. There's a very large community in general aviation that is truly passionate about being the best that they can be, following every bit of common sense and best practice that's out there. And when approached properly, small planes are generally still safer than driving and offer a sense of freedom that really can't be experienced any other way that I've found. Instead of being crammed into a giant metal tube with nothing but a porthole window that your seatmate complains about being open anyway, you can really experience flying from a totally new perspective, and it's way different than any commercial flight can offer. And this leads me to the less than ideal side of this flight, on a few points really. First, we're just outside of Knoxville here. Our flight plan from Chicago was to hit Athens, Georgia for fuel, and then go all the way to Stuart, Florida. That's well within the capabilities of the Columbia to do this with that one stop, or even nonstop if we had had the tailwind that was present the day before this flight. But Florida seemed to have this idea of whipping up some off-season warm water precipitation. Now you can see ahead of us the severe clear conditions that we had in Chicago won't really be staying with us the whole way. Obviously, I'm making this video so we all know how the story ends in general, but the second legs of this flight turn into some expansion of my personal minimums. And that's all well and good. And it makes it even harder to talk about the topic I hinted at the beginning, which is that this may end up being one of the last series of flights that I share in the aviation portion of this channel. And it might actually be a pause on my aviation journey temporarily. See, life has a way of forcing you to prioritize what's most important. And while aviation is something I'm completely obsessed with, it happens to be a very expensive hobby. And as you may have seen in other parts of this channel, we're also working on building a new house. And that happens to be a very expensive endeavor. So while I'm a working engineer, I'm not yet a monetized YouTuber and still need to admit when it doesn't make sense to try and have it all. But let's get back to enjoying this trip. And while we're here, just outside Knoxville, we get to see the other thing that isn't an everyday occurrence, but it can also be a way to give back a little bit as a pilot, which is reporting anomalies that aren't always seen immediately from the ground.
Knoxville asked me to report some fires to you, and I see 4 small fires burning here on the ridge, lat long 3608 north by 8413 is my estimate.
Now, wildfires are more prevalent on the West Coast. It wasn't us that reported this one, but it was a good call that the Southwest flight did, since when I was flying back over the same area the next day on my way home, those small fires had grown noticeably, though it was already being addressed by crews. You may have also noticed we jumped forward a little bit in the video, and we'll get to see in time-lapse here one of my favorite things about flying, and that is being in and amongst the many layers that can exist in the clouds. Being between and passing through those layers is something that's always felt surreal to me, and I'm glad I got to share that experience on this flight. It's also one of the last times on this trip to Florida that we'll see the sun. Showed you a moment ago what sort of weather system we're flying towards. But this video is already getting long enough, so I'm going to save that leg for the next video. In the meantime, we can speed through the visual approach into Athens, which was completely uneventful. We'll check in real time on the touchdown, which was definitely not my best of the day. And then we'll wrap up this video showing one of the biggest highlights of the day for that aviation nerd flying next to me. While we taxi up to that final highlight, if you've made it this far, I'd like to ask that you consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons down below. If I can get enough engagement and hit that monetizing threshold for YouTube, I'd love to be able to continue sharing some of these experiences with more of the Randys of the world, and subsequently with all of you who are watching now. But as we roll into the ramp, we are greeted with that final highlight of a Honda jet prepping to roll out. In his career, Randy's had the opportunity to help design components that are in active production for this plane and many others that are out there flying. And it's definitely been a fun way for him to interact with the hobby in more ways than being behind a CAD tool. Now, while we get out and admire that jet like kids at a car show, I hope you'll get out and consider exploring the world of aviation a little more too. And thanks for watching.
Got a Honda jet over here.
Oh yeah? Got parts on that.
You do what, the flaps on that one?
I designed a flap controller.